Um, we're here this evening to talk really about whether Parliament is fit for purpose. And I'm Eloise Ellis from the Law School at UEA, and I'm delighted to introduce our panellists, Baroness Jones, the very new Baroness Jones of Molescombe, and Richard Bacon, MP for South Norfolk. I just want to introduce them a little bit more, and then we'll hand over to them to introduce themselves a bit and talk about Parliament. And we're going to try and facilitate a conversation. After 40 minutes or so, we'd like to welcome questions. So if you want to start thinking about the things you'd like to ask. So I'll start with Jenny, who I'm delighted to have here. She's the first Green Party peer, and she's only been in the House of Lords for, did we say 10 days?
10 days.
So all very new. And interestingly, that position was one for which she was selected democratically by Green Party members. And in itself, that's quite unusual. So we may want to consider that a little bit more. Also, she's still a serving Green Party London Assembly member, and in the last London mayoral election in 2012, Jenny was the third in line, so she came third ahead of the Liberal Democrats.
It was big, yeah.
And talking also about Richard, I think most of you who are local will know Richard. He's been the MP for South Norfolk for 12 years, since 2001. He's also been voted Backbencher of the Year on a number of occasions, Parliamentarian of the Year, and a whole host of other awards. One of the reasons he's particularly here today is as a high-profile member of the Public Accounts Committee, which I certainly, with my passion for Select Committee research, is very much a high-profile, effective scrutiniser, I think one of the most effective select committees. And as a member of that, examining controversial issues, universal credit, we talked about outsourcing, which is coming up soon, and a whole variety of things. The House magazine named Richard Select Committee Member of the Year last year, and I'll have to read out what they've said, which may embarrass him slightly. He was described as forensic, energetic and committed. Richard Bacon has carved a political niche as the Public Accounts Committee's most effective performer. One final thing before I hand over to Richard and Jenny. Richard has also recently co-authored a book. Can I say with your brother-in-law?
You can.
I have, so. Entitled Conundrum, What Every Government Gets Things Wrong and What We Can Do About It. And I believe this is for sale on Amazon, but the price is rising.
For some reason, the price is rising. I suppose it's supply and demand, but get in while stocks last, that's my advice.
Okay. So I'd like to open this evening's discussion really by asking both of you to take a few moments to explain to me, or all of us, what your general perspective on Parliament is. Is it fit for purpose? What do you think it's for? Is it primarily for legislation, scrutiny, representation, or a variety of those? And we'll start with Jenny, I think. Ladies first, especially since it's Women in Parliament is the topic for Parliament Week this year.
I am here to talk about is Parliament fit for purpose, but of course I'm here under entirely fraudulent because I've only been in Parliament for 10 days. And before that, I really didn't pay very much attention. But in the past 10 days, I've had a crash course in what the House of Lords means. And of course, in understanding the House of Lords, it's inevitable that I understand some of what the House of Commons does as well. The House of Lords is a very, very strange institution. Absolutely nobody there has a mandate because they're not elected. They're all appointed by various means. Some of them have genuinely succeeded in life. Some of them are eminent people in law, in manufacturing, in art, whatever, and it's very exciting to know that I'll meet some of those people. But then some of them are there just because they've got a lot of money and they've managed to donate a lot of money to a particular political party. And I do think that is a terrible shame because, of course, many of those people don't use the position. There are something like 800 peers at the moment, and I think half of them play almost no role in the House of Lords at all. Now, that might be good, I guess, if they just have bought their seat. But at the same time, it does seem a pity because I think in many ways, it makes the House of Lords seem even more superfluous than it might. On the day that I was introduced, my day of introduction, how long have I got, by the way?
As long as you want.
Because I can bore for Britain on politics. On the day of my introduction, which is when I had to wear a red wool cloak and fake fur, being a green, and swear allegiance to the Queen, which was not easy for somebody like me. I'm not a Republican, but at the same time I do find the whole royal bit quite overblown, and I had to affirm, because I'm an atheist as well, I had to affirm my allegiance and my duty to the Queen and all her heirs in perpetuity and sign over my soul, more or less. And unlike one MP, I did not cross my fingers. I spoke sincerely. It was a rite of passage, affirming my loyalty to the Queen. At that day, part of the convention is you go back into the chamber to listen to some of the debate. And it turned out that the debate was on the gagging bill, on the transparency of lobbying in Parliament bill, which is something I care very much about. I think it's a pernicious bill in its current form. And I was very happy to go in there and vote. It was actually voting for a delay in implementation. And I felt mortified when the opportunity was taken away from me because the vote was dropped. There was a deal done about a reduced amount of time and so on. And it gave me a feeling that the House of Lords can do good stuff. I'd heard that the debate is good generally, that the people in there who do speak are generally people who know what they're talking about. They spent a lifetime in the world that they worked in, and they're very well informed. Unlike the House of Commons, where people often give up their jobs at the age of 25 and go to politics, and so don't really know much about the way of the world. I do hope that's not true of you.
No, it's not.
No. I don't want to be unnecessarily rude. That would be awful. So two things struck me. First of all, that the House of Lords is a force for good, that we do need a second chamber, that we need a check and a balance on Parliament that is full of, in a sense, amateurs, people who don't know much about the way businesses work or whatever, that they're getting everything second-hand. And of course, the other thing that struck me was that lobbying is part of, and deals are part of the process in the House of Lords as well. I'm collecting enough material at the moment for a succession of diaries because some of the practices in the House of Lords are so arcane, so archaic, and people have said it takes a year to get used to the processes, you know, just putting down questions and amendments and finding the right paperwork and so on. Absolutely incredible. My day job is as a Green Party politician on the London Assembly, which is entirely different. The Assembly has virtually no executive powers. It's a scrutiny body, and our job is to scrutinise the Mayor of London. We're elected at the same time as the Mayor of London, and there's 25 of us, 4 different political parties, and our job is to make sure that the Mayor acts with probity, that he does his job for Londoners, to the benefit of Londoners. And I've now seen 2 mayors do the job. Ken Livingstone did it for 8 years, and now Boris Johnson is into his 2nd term. And it would be difficult to find 2 people doing the job in such different ways. The current mayor does not pay much attention. I'm going to try not to say anything too slanderous. He delegates virtually everything. And somebody said to me very early on, if you want to convince him of something, you have to be the last person in the room, because if somebody speaks to him after you, then he'll probably take up their idea instead. I don't know if you know Boris at all.
He was in Parliament with me in 2001.
Well, he wasn't there very much, though, was
we were
he?
elected at the same time, but then he went off when he became mayor. So I came across him from time to time, but I can't say I know him well.
No. Well, I feel after these 5, 6 years, I know him quite well. He is charming and he's very funny. But the Assembly is a place where there are 2 Greens, 2 Lib Dems, quite a few Tories and then more Labour. And the fact is that if I want to get anything done, if I actually want to affect anything, I have to work with the other political parties. And I work with all of them, issue by issue. So, for example, I recently put a motion to the Assembly, which was passed unanimously. I worked with a Tory. It was on protection of wildlife, and it was a pleasure to work with him, and it was effective. So, as a Green, I'm used to working with people, other political persuasions, and in fact, I do find Tories quite restful. I have so little to discuss with them. There's so little agreement that actually it's, you know, you might as well just chat and gossip, and it's very relaxing. And I mean, I have been made aware that the House of Lords is a little bit like that. There's a very collegiate feel. It's not like the House of Commons, where there's sort of party political rants from either side of the chamber. From the debates I've seen already and the debates that people have told me about, not only is there a level of knowledge in those debates, but there's a lack of party political sniping, which I think is very refreshing, and I expect to do the same. And the Green Party view of the House of Lords is that it should be abolished. It is not representative of Britain. It is not representative in any way, and therefore it really needs to be scrapped. We believe there should be a second chamber, but it should be elected, and of course elected under a system of proportional representation. And so in spite of the fact that I'd spent from the 1st of August until the 5th of November, which is when I was told it was going to happen, or it came out that I was going to be appointed and my appointment, I spent those months moaning about the House of Lords and saying I wanted it abolished. When I got in there, everybody has been universally nice to me. Nobody's come up and said, "You're that stupid woman who wants to abolish us, aren't you?" Everybody's been just charming to me, and I think it bodes well for the future. And I'm sure there are other Greens in there. I'm not the first Green in the House of Lords, because others have actually crossed the floor. I'm the first Green to be appointed. And as such, it came as a bit of a shock, in fact, because we've been asking for a seat for years. And I don't think any of us really ever thought it would happen. But thanks to Rupert Read and his connections in high places, I gather he told somebody, "You had it in your manifesto, you know, a more diverse House of Lords. Well, what about it?" So here's the result. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
And I think overall, I'm aware that any politician finds it hard to stay in touch. I think any politician stops being an ordinary person, and particularly when you're in the House of Lords or you're in the Commons, it is such an incredibly privileged place. How can you possibly understand the stresses and strains of ordinary life, the stresses and strains of somebody, you know, who has to pay the bedroom tax, or who has just lost their benefits, they've been sanctioned, because they didn't try hard enough for work or something. I think it's incredibly hard to really understand, and it's partly why I find the gagging bill such an awful bill, because at least charities do bring that voice. They bring the voice of the underprivileged, and they bring the voice of people who are vulnerable, and so that's why it's incredibly important to listen to them. And I very much hope that I will be a good peer, a good Green, not break too many rules unintentionally, and I very much hope the Green Party benefits from having a seat there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. Well, I'll try and be brief, and then hopefully we can get into some discussion. Jenny's raised a whole variety of different points there, and we have very different perspectives, because Jenny's been appointed to an unelected House 10 days ago. I've been elected now for the 3rd time to the lower house, the House of Commons, having tried it 4 times. My first time was in 1997. And Jenny said a lot that sparks thoughts, but I'll start just by saying a couple of things about what I think is still good about Parliament, and perhaps some of what's less good. Eloise, in her introduction, talks about various roles. Plainly, one of the main roles is to make law. We're a legislature, so we pass laws. I have as little to do with that as I possibly can. When I was first elected, you get bunged on standing committees for bills. They've changed the name of them now, but I still call them standing committees. Because when I was first elected, you didn't really have any choice. You just you go along and you sit there, and they prefer that you speak if you're in opposition and that you not speak if you're in government. But the result of the exercise is that there are more laws added to the statute book, and because I have the quaint view that there are far too many laws already, I would rather not add further to them. But when you're a new backbencher, you really have no choice. But as you sort of have been around a bit, there are new backbenchers behind you who get shoved on the Railway Transport Safety Bill, and you're talking about whether something is law or not as you're on a train crossing the border between England and Scotland in clause 74B, and it's something that needs doing. A lot of it, of course, comes from Europe. A lot of the laws we pass because there's been a directive that then requires to be transposed into UK legislation. We might come on to the EU, I suppose, at some point. We've got some elections next year, I'm told. The second role of Parliament is one of scrutiny, and that's probably in Westminster what I devote most of my time to. Eloise mentioned that I sit on a committee which looks at public expenditure, the Public Accounts Committee. We are rather different from most other committees in that we don't look at policy. So the Transport Committee might consider the question whether the government of the day should be spending more money on roads or on rail. We wouldn't consider that because that's a policy question. We would look at the question, if you're spending money on roads, for example, on gritting the highways or indeed on new roads, are you spending that money wisely, effectively, efficiently and economically? And we would do the same from every other subject that we look at, from the teaching of primary school mathematics to the procurement of a new frigate, to the transmission of hospital-acquired infection, to the National Program of IT and the Health Service, to universal credit, to outsourcing of government services, to you name it. But we look at it through the lens of effectiveness and efficiency and economy, rather than whether the government should be doing it or not. We leave the should questions to others, including government and the opposition. And that's probably my main activity at Westminster. But of course there's a third strand to what Parliament does, which is probably in some ways the first strand, namely representation. Because as an elected MP, I have two jobs. I have one down in Westminster and I have one up in Norfolk. And the one in Norfolk is the one that is prior. I'm only in Parliament because I've been sent there by the people in my constituency. And my first job is to represent them. And the best way, I find, by far, to keep in touch with what's going on is to meet people regularly in my constituency surgeries. Jenny said earlier it must be very difficult, and if you ever get the chance, if you haven't been, to go around the Houses of Parliament, do, and contrast the relatively austere chamber of the House of Commons with the unbelievably Victorian Rococo excess of the House of Lords. You could easily get carried away in that environment, I'm sure. And I find the most grounding thing I do is meeting my constituents in their surgeries, because actually when you meet constituents in a surgery, they're only coming to you because they've got a problem, and quite often you're the advocate of last resort. Years ago, I had a farmer come to see me, and he was in his 80s, he was in tears, and he was holding this piece of paper which looked suspiciously to me like a bankruptcy order, but I had not seen one before, so I nipped out of the room, faxed it to my old lawyer friend just to check, and he said, yes, he's bankrupt. And what's more, he's got it from a judge who, because my lawyer friend does this sort of thing, said it's one of the most difficult to get a bankruptcy order out of. So there was a situation where actually if the guy had come to see me 6 months previously, I might have been able to help him a lot more than I was able to in the circumstances. But my point is, you often meet people who are coming to see you because they are at the end of their tether. Of the most annoying thing I've ever heard on broadcast radio in recent years was when, you'll remember the sting operation in which some Daily Telegraph journalists went into Vince Cable's surgery and recorded him saying, that bastard Rupert Murdoch, I'm going to get him, And then it turned out that actually, once it was publicly revealed that he was, quote, prejudiced, the responsibilities had to be transferred away from him to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. I remember hearing some journalist on the radio saying afterwards, saying it really wasn't such a bad thing to do this sort of sting operation in an MP's surgery. Well, it's not exactly the confessional, is it? And I remember shouting at my radio thinking, you stupid man, that's exactly what it is. I mean, there's nothing you don't see in an MP surgery, including people who are desperate because they are just about to have their children taken away from them, people who are desperate because they have had their children taken away from them. I had a lady come to see me because her husband had just been extradited and was in jail 3,000 miles away. You get people who have come to you because of the way they've been bullied by the social services, or because there are allegations of paedophilia in the school where their child goes and they're worried that the school doesn't seem to be taking any action. You name it, you see it, and often in desperate human circumstances. So it really is a window not just on ordinary human life, but on the most desperate situations that people find themselves in. And one of the most heartening things you can do as an MP is when you can make things go right for them in your activity through your surgery, and when you can stand up for people who are unable to stand up for themselves and who are being bullied this way and that by an uncaring bureaucracy. So the representation part of what I do, I consider to be probably the most important. There is a direct connection sometimes with what goes on in Westminster. For example, I had an accountant come to see me a few weeks ago about the construction industry scheme, which was developed by HMRC, the tax authority, as a way of trying to prevent people being paid in cash on building sites, essentially, to get income tax in from people who might otherwise not pay what they should. And it was devised many, many years ago when pay packets were literally that, when they were £20 notes in brown envelopes. Now, of course, the vast majority of people, including those who are working on construction sites, have a bank account and they're paid directly by a transfer. So it's much, much more traceable, much more auditable. And this accountant's point was it's still costing a huge amount of money to the industry and not driving any direct benefit. Well, the following week after he came to see me, or 3 weeks after he came to see me, I had the chief executive of HMRC in my crosshairs across the floor of the Public Accounts Committee. So I raised it with her directly. I'm now having a meeting with the Institute of Chartered Accountants and my constituent and several other accountants with the Treasury Minister responsible for this area. And I'm hoping on that and other issues, we might make a bit of progress. But the initial spur for it, from my point of view, came from my constituent. And I've had many similar cases in all kinds of areas, ranging from people come to see me because they've got macular degeneration and they can't get the drug that they require, and then you can stand up and talk about it with the health secretary the following day, and he has to attend to it. He's got to be across the subject and answer you across the floor of the House of Commons. So there's a very, very direct link there, and I feel the representation part doesn't only work in the constituency surgery, it actually does make a difference in Westminster as well. Gosh, we've talked about so many other things, and I think it's probably time if I shut up soon and we move on to questions. But Jenny raised a range of issues about the House of Lords and its powers. I thought the of course proportional representation was a fascinating assumption, which perhaps we might talk about. Jenny talked about the arcane nature of the House of Lords, and I'm sure compared with the Commons it probably does seem that way, but it's worth speaking up for a moment for some of what appear to be arcane practices. For example, in the House of Commons, unlike in the European Parliament, say, or in many legislatures, we don't vote by pressing a button. We vote by going into a lobby where there are several entrances and only one exit. And as you exit, you are counted out by two tellers on either side and parliamentary clerks who tick your name off on a list, and then they compare and make sure they've got the accurate result. One of the huge advantages of that is that you can guarantee that you will see people, including government ministers, at certain times of the day. So, for example, Edward Acton, the Vice-Chancellor of this university, wrote to me, emailed me one merry afternoon at about 4 o'clock on the subject of student visas, Tier 4 visas. And by the time I replied to him at 9 o'clock that evening, I was able to say in my email, "Dear Edward, thank you so much for your email on this subject. I'm pleased to tell you I've had the chance to discuss this with the Home Secretary and the Universities Minister and the Immigration Minister." And this was 5 hours later. Well, the only reason that's possible is because of the, quote, arcane way in which we vote. And it does actually have a purpose. The same is true of the fact that in the chamber we address each other in the third person. So I wouldn't say to Jenny, "Don't you realise that you're an out-of-date, tree-hugging vegetarian pinko?" I would say, "Madam Speaker, doesn't she realise that she's an out-of-date, vegetarian, tree-hugging pinko?" And the effect of that, rhetorically, is necessarily to take your foot off the gas. It lowers the temperature, by definition, and it has a utility. And it's the case with most arcane things that they do have some sort of utility. And when they don't, they tend to fall into disuse. And I might only point out, and then I will conclude, that I was delighted that Jenny finds it restful talking to Conservatives. I'll just point out that the word conserve is cognate with Conservative, and that I believe Greens are interested in conserving things. So we may have more to talk about than you might suspect.
Can I prompt you with another question? This is one that's probably slightly more directed to Richard at the moment, but might be something that of interest to you as you progress through the Lords. I'm really thinking about the recent developments, the right reforms, particularly in terms of select committees. And I'm very much of the opinion that since 2010, with the Backbench Business Committee and particularly the election of the chairs and so on, that there's been so much more independence and I suppose more of a mandate to scrutinise and a mandate to be more effective. And I really just would like to take your views on that as well as a sort of high-profile select committee member.
Well, I think the election of select committee chairs is a very good thing, and indeed all members of select committees are now elected. When I first got into Parliament, I wanted to be on the Public Accounts Committee. Actually, I knew I did before I got into Parliament, so I spent every moment I could, the moment I was elected. In fact, I started lobbying people I knew before I got elected to Parliament to get onto the PAC, because it was all done by smoke and mirrors, and you talk to the whips and eventually your name emerges if you're lucky. And George Osborne and I were the two people in 2001 who got onto the Public Accounts Committee. I don't know what happened to him, but I've stayed on the committee ever since. And now it's elected. And the chair of the committee is elected by the entire House. And then in relation to the number of seats you have on the committee, the party caucuses, the party fractions, as they'd say in Germany, vote in their party groups for the slot. So for me to get on, I'd have to persuade the Conservative MPs to vote for me, whereas a Liberal would have to persuade the Liberal MPs in Parliament to vote for him or her. And it has, I think, increased the independence. You can see through the visibility and the activeness of the Cultural, Media and Sport Committee over Murdoch and phone hacking, and over the Home Affairs Committee, over Plebgate, and not just our committee is obviously very active in lots of different areas, but it has generally raised the profile. It does very much depend on the individual MPs on the committee and on the chair and how determined they are to be independent of government. And that's not something you can write down in rules. It depends on the individual personalities. But I think it has been a step change which has been useful. I suspect in years to come, looking back on it, we will see a whole series of changes, including the introduction of the select committees as they now are in 79, and then the election of them. And we will see incrementally, step by step, looking back on it probably over a 50 or 60 year period, we'll think, my, how on earth did we get here? And we're in the process of that, we're in the middle of that now.
I don't know anything about the select committee process, I'm afraid, and as a single Green, I'm highly unlikely ever to be on a committee because that's just not how things work. If I could reply to Richard for a couple of things. First of all, I'm not vegetarian. I was vegetarian for 25 years until I worked as an archaeologist in Ethiopia, and lunch was spaghetti with nothing on it, and dinner was boiled goat. And I lost, it's very high, Ethiopia, 6,000 feet or something, and I had a lot of trenches open across a hillside, and I lost about half a stone in a couple of weeks because I wasn't eating the meat, only spaghetti, and once you've eaten boiled goat, why wouldn't you eat things that taste good? So I'm not a vegetarian. And thinking about how people treat each other in the House of Commons, there's a very famous clip of Dennis Skinner saying, half the Tories on the opposite benches are crooks. And the Speaker says, now, you know, we could take that back or something. Dennis Skinner said, OK then, half the Tories on the opposite benches aren't crooks. So I guess there's a way of saying everything. Let me give you an example of something that I find very arcane. I was talking to a civil servant who was showing me around the House of Lords. And we were chatting. We came to quite a large room, probably this size, the Prince's Chamber, if anybody knows it. And I asked her a question, and she didn't answer me. She just looked at me, so I thought she hadn't heard. So I repeated my question, and she still didn't answer me. And she kept walking. And she stepped through a doorway, turned back to me, and said, "I can't speak when we're on that carpet. Only peers can speak when you're on that carpet." Now, tell me if there's some sort of justification for that at Westminster. I mean, can you imagine a carpet that people can't speak on unless they are a lord or a lady? I mean, if you can justify that, Richard, you deserve a prize.
Well, to be fair, all I can say is I know exactly where the Prince's Chamber is. It's immediately behind the throne, and I have stood on the carpet and spoken many times, and I haven't been struck by a thunderbolt. I think one can get distracted by these things because they're not that important, and they're certainly probably honoured in the breach more often than they are in the observance. Jenny made an interesting point about the minority parties not getting onto select committees, and in fact, one of the things that the Wright reformers, Tony Wright, who was an MP, he was the MP for Cannock Chase and the chairman of the Public Administration Committee in the last Parliament, in fact the last two Parliaments, and did a whole series of good reports during that time. With his Public Administration Committee, which I apart from the PAC and National Audit Office reports, the single biggest source for my book actually was his reports on the broader themes of relations between ministers and civil servants. But he came up with a thing called the Wright Report, which suggested a series of changes, including not just the election of select committee members, but a whole range of other mostly pretty sensible adjustments. And one of them was that, and I've just been looking at the Political and Constitutional Reform Select Committee report that came out in the summer on it, which points out that many of the right reforms have still not yet been implemented. But one of them that this committee refers to is that there's no reason when vacancies arise, they shouldn't from time to time be filled by members of minority parties. And personally, I would support that. There are a couple of ways that they say you might do it. One is by enlarging the number of members of the committee. but getting enough members who always turn up and take a serious interest is bad enough as it is. The other is by a rather loose and I suspect slightly discretionary way of saying when vacancies come along, making sure that the minority parties get a bit more of a shout. And I think that could be done in a relatively informal way. And I don't know if Caroline Lucas sits on a select committee in the Commons, but it seems to me, having been elected as a Member of Parliament for the Greens, it is stupid if there isn't the possibility of her getting on to a select committee that deals with issues close to her heart, whether it's environmental audit or whatever else it is. Although, of course, she has to get elected under our system, and there aren't many Green MPs to support her. In fact, she's only got one vote, hers. But it does seem to me that we ought to be able to find a way to allow minority parties a bit more of a shout, and that the arising of vacancies might be a way in which that could sometimes happen. I'm less interested in whether there's exact fairness in these things. I always think most constitutional arrangements with a small c, what actually matters is not whether they're, quote, fair or symmetrical. You can have quite a lumpy and unbalanced and asymmetrical constitutional arrangement in whatever organisation you're talking about. What matters is that people consent to it, that they acquiesce in it, that they think it's okay. And when it's not okay, you make adjustments accordingly. I mean, I've got some mates who are in the Scottish National Party, and they don't get much representation on select committees either. Certainly not in the many of the domestic policy areas. And I don't think it would hurt if they had a bit more of a shout.
Before I went into the Lords, I was given a sort of rundown by a Labour peer whom I knew from before, and he said two things he said a lot of things that stuck in my mind, but two things in particular. He said, first of all, I was very underdressed for a member of the House of Lords, and I was going to have to buy some better clothes. And the second thing he said was, because people are so expert, there will be people in there who know everything about a particular topic. What I work on mostly on the London Assembly is policing, and I work on it from a point of view of civil liberties mostly. And he said the one thing that I would have as an advantage is that my knowledge is current. And so I think there is an argument for including smaller people on select committees if they have the skills, and it is down to the skills, because the select committees need to do a good job. And
and there is actually, contrary to that, there is the reverse tendency sometimes, because of course the House of Lords is full of ex-defence secretaries, ex-foreign secretaries, ex-chief of the defence staff. Richard Dannett, who was ex-chief of the general staff, the head of the army, who missed out on the defence staff job because he was too outspoken and said what he thought and stood up for the troops. Of course, he's in the House of Lords now as well, our local, as we previously named, Sir Richard Dannett. There is a danger that you might end up with a debate about the war that took place 20 years ago, as it were, that people are not actually current, that they're not up to date. I'm not making any comment about any particular person, but that is a potential risk. And one of the great advantages of the House of Lords, as it's currently constituted, is that, I mean, it's got a lot theoretically wrong with it. You wouldn't necessarily have started from here. It doesn't work in theory, but it does work in practice. And one of the great advantages of it is that the people who are in it, and I'm not just talking about financially, although a lot of people in the House of Lords have made a lot of money, but in a broader sense, they've made their bones in some discipline or professional area of expertise. And in many cases, they're still at it. They're still practicing at it. So they've got something real and current to contribute. It's not always the case that members of the House of Commons know nothing, although it is too often the case that they don't know enough. I find the kind of the bear pit partisan petty point scoring aspect of the House of Commons one of the most trying and tiresome aspects of it. And one of the most annoying aspects of it is the bit that is most widely seen, the bit that people think is the most representative of what the House of Commons does, namely Prime Minister's Question Time. It's when the chamber is always full, and it's the bit that is most often repeated on the news, is by a country mile the least representative bit of what it is that we do. If you really want to see what it is that members of Parliament do, then go and spend several weeks watching members of Parliament going line by line through the finance bill, or through tax legislation, or through the railway and transport safety bill, or the asylum and immigration bill, or whatever it is, week in, week out, or indeed on select committees like ours, looking at areas of expenditure and trying to ascertain by intense dialogue with senior officials, based on highly validated and up-to-date reports from authoritative bodies like the National Audit Office, how on earth it is that the government of the day is managing to spend our constituents' taxes. If you do that, you'll get a better idea of what it is that MPs get up to, and that is the bit that gets onto the TV the least, because it's the least dramatic, the least confrontational, it has the least that's televisual. So that is an issue.
I want to say as well that, of course, most of the photographs of the House of Lords are when it's almost empty and people are fast asleep on the benches. And my experience is actually the debates are full. When there's something to be debated or voted on, actually limited experience, of course, but it is full. I've also found out why peers go to sleep. There are several reasons. The first is that the benches are very comfy. The second is it's very hot in the chamber. It's far too hot. I mean, and you're not allowed to take your jacket off. And the third reason is the acoustics are not very good. And the audio outlet is at the back of everybody's seat. So everybody, of course, leans back to hear what's being said. And with fatal, well, not fatal, with one hopes, with sleep as a consequence. I want to do something I don't often do, which is I want to backtrack slightly, because I think I was slightly unfair about MPs, because of course their surgeries are an incredibly important part of their job, and they do get to hear things. When I was a councillor in Southwark, and I had surgeries like that, and you hear absolutely heartbreaking cases, and of course people come often far too late for you to help them, because you are a sort of last resort, and that's a real shame. But I also found as a councillor that I couldn't garden in my front garden without being talked to and given jobs, and I ended up, my front garden is hopelessly overgrown because people still stop to chat and ask me to do things when I'm in my front garden. But as an assembly member, we don't have the same constituency at all, and of course the House of Lords don't have a constituency either. So it's possible the House of Commons, that MPs might stay more in touch than the House of... That's a big concession for me.
Well, I think what it is that they're in touch with different things. And I mean, I have the same experience. If I go and if I'm short of things to do, which frankly doesn't happen very often, but if I go and if I want to go to this post office and buy some stamps, I will find by the time I've finished, I've got 5 new jobs, 5 new constituency cases to do, both on the way in and on the way queuing and on the way out. But I think what the House of Commons at its best does do, what the members doing their constituency surgeries at their best do. And of course, again, it varies with the individual quality of the individual MP, but I have to say my experience is that the ability to do that and how well it is done bears absolutely no relation to which political party people happen to represent. There are good and less good MPs doing the job of a surgery in every party. That's very much a grassroots, bottom-up kind of activity. The House of Lords brings to its discussions and its deliberations the highest level of expertise in the country on a whole range of subjects. So if there is a subject that requires a discussion on brain surgery, there will be brain surgeons there. And if it's a discussion about human fertilization and embryology, there will be people who actually have won Nobel Prizes in that sort of area. And so that is unique in legislatures among the world. And although I can see lots wrong with the House of Lords, I'm very reluctant to say, away with it, until I'm pretty clear what that which replaced it would look like. And all I know at the moment is, we've got to this ludicrous position where, and it really is hilarious, that instead of just having hereditary peers, which no one, at least no one much these days, would try to defend the principle of, we have a rump of hereditary peers. And when one of them dies, they have a little by-election. But the only people who are allowed to vote for it, say a Labour hereditary peer dies, and there are such people, there are only about, 15 Labour hereditary peers in the whole country. So the by-election, the people who can vote in it, are those 15 who vote for one of them to become the next hereditary Labour peer. And the same is true of each of the other groups. Now, a more Ruritanian system, it would be almost impossible to think of, but that is the direct result of the way the last Labour government, with a massive majority in Parliament, left it. They could have done more, but they didn't. And I suspect what will probably happen is that at some point they'll say, right, all the hereditaries who are there now, when you die, you don't get replaced. But on present,
they tried to do that in the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act in 2010, but it was lost in the wash-up.
Yes, it was. And the fact is, I heard a speech on this on yesterday in Parliament the other day. There are a lot of really young hereditary peers, so it could take 30, 40 years to come out in the wash, even if they did go and do that. But I'm much more interested in what would replace it, because if you just got rid of the hereditaries and therefore had a purely appointed House, it would become even more of... I mean, I was reading the other day about people who've been appointed to the Lords recently. There was a chap, and of course there are people who've, quote, bought their seat in one way or another, and there's nothing so crass as a direct relationship, but when you give £800,000 to the one of the parties that you've made selling pizzas, and then suddenly you turn up as a peer, or whether it's fairly obvious that donations to political parties play no small part in this in some way or other.
Not in the Green Party, by the way. If anybody wants to donate, we can't promise you a seat anywhere.
No, at the moment, but if there were enough rich Greens, it might change. But anyway, I mean, my point is that everyone knows that this sort of goes on in some sort of way, and it's been slapped down, and it's plainly not the way things should be. Were we to get rid of the hereditaries and move to an entirely appointed system, my suspicion is it would get worse. The Canadian Senate is probably the worst example in the world of this. And I would like to see, personally, I would be content with an appointed House of Lords if it were much, much smaller and a bit more like the US Senate, which is also very collegiate, where they only have 2 members from each of the 50 states, so they've got 100 members. If they can manage in America with that, I think we ought to be able to, although it's important not to forget that America has 50 states which each have their own state legislatures, and in some cases a state Senate as well. So it's not quite a valid comparison just to say we ought to be able to manage with 100, because we don't have all of that. But if we are to get rid of it, we've got to be, in its present form, we've got to be very clear what we are getting in its place. And the single biggest thing that people who spout on about the need for its being democratic, but don't basically want to change the current relationship. You spoke earlier about the primacy of the Commons. I think don't seem to take on board is that there is no way, I think realistically, that you could make the House of Lords elected and not expect that it would then assert its greater legitimacy. It has powers now which it doesn't use, and if it were elected, it would be co-equal in terms of its legitimacy with the House of Commons. And the idea that you should have... By the way, I know lots of people are. I'm not necessarily opposed to the Commons sharing its primacy with the House of Lords. The thing that interests me about an elected House of Lords is if I thought there were a chance that it would increase the power of Parliament vis-à-vis the executive and make the executive more accountable. But you can be absolutely sure if it were elected, the government would take a much greater interest in controlling the House of Lords than it does at the moment. At the moment, you hear on the radio quite regularly, over a period of a year or so, you'd hear it any number of times, the government was defeated in the House of Lords this evening. And I listen to it and I think, well, that's the House of Lords doing its job. Whereas if it were elected and the government were much more dependent on an elected majority, I think it would try far harder to control what the House of Lords does and how it is. And it's not obvious to me that it would produce an improvement. It's not obvious to me that the Nobel Prize winning scientists and all the rest of them would necessarily run for office. And they might. I suppose you could imagine maybe people like Lord Dannatt, Sir Richard Dannatt, running for office. I would like to think that if it were going to be elected, it would be different from the House of Commons, rather like in the US Senate, they're elected on a different basis, on a different franchise for a different period of time. There's no point at all, in my view, in just having a replica of the House of Commons. It would be completely pointless.
I think this is why you need proportional representation, so that actually you do get a more diverse body, because at the moment it is a diverse body at the moment with a great deal of experience. But as we both said, there are people who are lords who really shouldn't be there. I mean, I do find it difficult in a secular society to understand why we have so many bishops in there. But I think if we have proportional representation, the Green Party policy on this is that you have an elected chamber under PR, and you have a term limit of 10 years, so that you're actually in there for 10 years. That means, and you can't stand again. That means actually once you're in there, you are not dependent on your party to get you re-elected or reselected in any way, and it will give you a degree of independence that I think MPs don't have, and it is part of the problem. You said earlier that if you're in government you don't speak, and if you're in the opposition you do speak.
In standing committees for bills, yeah. There is a downside to that. I mean, ask yourself, what would be, even with the best possible motives, if you had the purest members of Parliament you could think of, let's just imagine we'd all been elected in 2010 for 10 years, and we knew we couldn't be re-elected, and we knew there was no possibility of ever being a candidate again. Do we really think that wouldn't slowly, bit by bit, alter our behaviour over the subsequent... I've now got 7 years to run, apparently, under the system. And I'm thinking, well, do I really want to go to the gymnastics club where I agreed I'd present the prizes because it is a Saturday afternoon. I haven't seen my wife and kids for the whole week. I mean, I actually think it's my duty to go and do those sorts of things because I didn't have to get elected to Parliament, and it's great fun when you get there, and you expect to spend most of your life as an MP being knackered because you're working very funny hours and lots of different days when other people don't work. On the other hand, nobody made you do it. You had to go and do it. But do I think that if we had a system where we knew we weren't going to run again, that eventually, drip by drip, your behaviour wouldn't start to change and be less interested in what your electorate thought and less interested in what the accountability mechanism would weaken? And I think it would also, therefore, if you were to have an elected House of Lords, if they knew they couldn't run again, I've no doubt that their accountability would be eroded. It may be that you don't want accountable peers in that sense. In which case, we've got a system at the moment that works in that way because you're not democratically accountable. You are accountable and you have to sort of justify your actions, but you're not democratically accountable. So we've got that system already.
Can I just add an extra element to that? The other concern that I personally would have about an elected House of Lords, career politicians. The virtues that you were extolling earlier, the whole point that you have people who are part-time peers who can be, the chairman of the Commission for appointing House of Lords is a part-time surgeon these days. You wouldn't have that. That's my concern with it. Not so much the accountability, the democracy element, it's the notion of career politicians. And I'd be interested to see what you both of you having done other things as well, think about the idea of people, not just in the Lords, but even in the Commons, having done nothing other than being involved in politics at different levels and then, sort of incestuous circle almost.
It's always incredibly difficult when you're proposing an idea to be absolutely sure about outcomes. I mean, and Greens actually, I would say, do, of all the political parties, do think about what's going to happen downstream. It's part of our nature that we're actually saying all the time, what impact will this have, whether it's food supply or whatever. But I do think that this might be the sort of thing that you do at the end of your career. That if you have, you are thinking, well, I might do this at the age of 60 and do it for 10 years, or it's the sort of thing you would do at the end of your career rather than the beginning of your career. I mean, the average age of the House of Lords at the moment is 70. So at 63, I've brought the average down a little bit. And it's still incredibly short of women, and of course, very short of ethnic minorities. I think we've got less than 5% of peers are ethnic minority. And 53.3% come from London and the South. That's a terrible imbalance. We are not representative of something. Something has to be done, quite obviously. And there's this phrase about democracy is the worst of all political systems, except all the other possibilities. And you could say that about the House of Lords at the moment. And when you are thinking about all these arcane things that take place there, and it is impossible to understand some of them. At the same time, it's a bit like a jumper, that if you start to pick at a thread, before long you've unpicked the whole thing, and I really do think it's time to... But I can see the difficulties, and I cannot imagine that this change is going to happen in my lifetime.
Jenny's sounding like a constitutional conservative with a small c, which is terrific. I think we're making progress. I was expecting it to take 10 years before she'd stand up and start defending existing institutions, but we've made quite a lot of progress in 45 minutes.
I didn't realise I'd said that.
I thought that Jenny's point about it's being towards the end of your... I accept that. I think it's being a house of elders. There's a difference between influence and power. Yeah. And if you look at the way we run most of our big public companies, you have a chief executive who's some thrusting person who wants to sort of take over the world, and you have a non-executive chairman who says, hold on a minute. And when you'll remember Lord Brown, who I think was an extremely effective head of BP, and who then eventually went, and there was a big row about should he go or should he stay longer. It was Peter Sutherland, who'd been a European Commissioner, and who was the chairman of BP, who eventually caused him eventually to sort of move on to other things. And most societies have a system where you have people with power and people who are older and wiser with a checking function, and a house of elders in some respects that has less power but more influence and has the capacity to say, I wouldn't do that if I were you. And actually there comes a point when if enough of them say it, and in a way it's quite ambiguous, but there is a sort of very nice point at which it becomes obvious that the House of Lords feels empowered to act because the government today is sufficiently far out of kilter, doesn't have the support of the public, and is going too far off on a limb, where the House of Lords then feels emboldened in a way that it might otherwise not. And there's always a nice balance between the point at which it feels it's got that strength and the point at which it feels it perhaps ought to let the government of the day have its way because it's democratic. And I quite like that. I talk about ambiguity in the book actually quite a lot, but in terms of the
What's the title again?
It's called Conundrum, Why Every Government Gets Things Wrong, and what we can do about it. And it's mostly about public expenditure and about the relations between ministers and civil servants and why we constantly make expenditure mistakes. But I think the issue of ambiguity is a very big one in our politics, and people regard it as a problem in many cases, when in fact it is in many cases a strength. There's a wonderful book called The Silence of Constitutions by Michael Foley, in which he talks about the gaps in explicitness, what he calls abeyances in constitutional structures, which are the reasons why constitutional entities, why polities survive rather than break. I think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson who said a foolish law is a rope of sand. And you need anything that doesn't flex will eventually break much more quickly. And I think one of the great advantages of our constitutional arrangements is that they have flexed and endured. I was speaking at a conference some years ago in Turkey on behalf of the OECD, and one of the country specialists, who was I think he was Belgian actually, but he was there with me. We were talking on the bus about various different governmental structures around the world and legislatures and parliaments. And he said, we were comparing various different systems, and he said, but of course, you British, you really have the perfect system. And I was going, really? I'm sorry, yes, that was a Belgian accent. The point he made was, he thought we had the perfect system or the best system. And my reaction was, really? Do you really think that? But seen from elsewhere, there are considerable assets in our system. I think we like knocking ourselves. It's something we're very good at. But I do think that our system has got tremendous strengths, and it's got the capacity to endure and to change. I mean, Winston Churchill used to say about the House of Commons that it was the best war-fighting machine ever devised, because he had to be able to gain consent for what it was that they were proposing to do. And despite everything, it came through. And Michael Lord, who was the MP just south of the border in central Suffolk, when he stood for Speaker some years ago, he said he didn't win it obviously, he said in his speech, I've never much cared for being called a politician, but I've always been very proud to be a member of Parliament. And that's exactly how I thought about it. I remember when I was first on the radio after I got elected, and some radio interviewer was talking to me and said, well, you as a politician, and I was sort of going, really? Who? Because I hadn't thought of myself like that particularly. And I'm much more interested in Parliament and strengthening Parliament and our institutions and making sure that they can defend us as a people, keep us free, and make sure that the taxes we're legally obliged to pay over are well looked after and well spent, than I am in party political bickering.
On that note, I think I'm going to bring Rupert Reid from Philosophy, to respond, and then we're going to open the floor to questions. So we could listen to this all evening, but I think we should give people a chance to ask some questions.
Sorry, we didn't let you in, did we? Sorry.
No.
Thanks, Eloise. Yeah, I'm just going to try to draw one or two threads together before we get into the questions. And first, may I say that as one of the co-organisers of this event, I'm really delighted with the debate that we've had so far. This is exactly the kind of thing that we had in mind, I think, when we created this event. If I might kind of attempt to characterise it, we've got on this side of myself here the conservative, the person who is basically saying long-established institutions should not be recklessly reformed. And while Richard is clearly not a dogmatic defender of the status quo, he's already said various things that he thinks could be changed a bit more, and things he's pleased have been changed in recent years. He's fundamentally defending the existing parliamentary institutions that we have in relation to the question of is Parliament fit for purpose that we're debating here tonight. And then over here we have someone who's newly arrived on the scene in Parliament and wants to shake it up. He's saying, look, there's some serious problems with our current parliamentary institutions. There's big things about them that have to change. So we have the long-established conservative versus the new radical, and it's lovely to see that debate unfolding. Yeah. But I do take Richard's point that there is something in conservatism which is to do with conservation, which is to do with valuing, and perhaps rightly valuing, what has lasted for a long time. And that connects with something in the attitude that Greens have of thinking that it's really important to preserve what we have and to be precautious in relation to big changes that people want to make. A big worry that Greens have, however, about Conservatives is whether they actually are, in this sense, generally conservative anymore, or whether their ideology now has become closer to the ideology that is called neoliberalism rather than conservatism. And this worry is crystallised around issues such as the attempted forest sell-off or the current semi-privatisation of the NHS. So perhaps we'll touch on this. I'd like to say a very quick word about these two individuals and my personal familiarity with them. Jenny's mentioned that she and I have we've known each other for years, but she and I have had contacts in recent months, partly because of this new appointment she's got to the House of Lords. It's actually that it wasn't in the manifesto of the Conservatives or the Lib Dems, but it was in the coalition agreement that they pledged that they would make the House of Lords representative in relation to the votes that were cast for Parliament at the next election. And it's that myself and some colleagues, including Caroline Lucas, have been using to seek to get Greens fairly represented in the House of Lords. And we were able recently to lobby our local MP, Chloe Smith, who I know, of course, from the Norwich North by-election campaign that I fought for the Greens in 2009. She was successful in that campaign. She was then became the minister in this area, and that's how those things started to
And is
happen.
coming in 2 weeks' time,
That's
so
right.
I expect to see quite a lot of you back in this room on the 29th.
Another little advert there, yeah. And in terms of Richard, there's a funny little story there. In the last Euro election campaign, I was standing for the Green Party in the proportional representation European elections. I was canvassing for votes in a lovely village in South Norfolk, and I was knocking on some of the doors, and I went off-piste for a moment. I thought, this one isn't on my list, but this house looks rather nice. I just had this feeling about it. I had this feeling, I bet the person who lives in this house is really green-minded. I bet I could win him over. So I rang the doorbell, and this man came to the door, and we both looked at each other, and he said, "I know you," and I said, "And I know you," and of course it was Richard. I didn't try very hard to persuade him to vote.
I tried to keep
Green.
him on the doorstep for as long as possible.
Yeah, and I said to, which is the traditional thing that any politico in the room will be familiar with, the traditional tactic when you're canvassed by someone from another party. But I replied to Richard, I've never quite understood this tactic, because of course, if you're keeping me on your doorstep, then I'm also keeping you from doing things that you could be doing for your party. So, as you'll have gathered, I'm a Green, as well as being here at UEA, a philosopher. At the end of this evening, you'll hear from my colleague, Professor Alan Phillison, who is in politics. As a philosopher, one of the things I'm interested in about this debate here this evening is that philosophers are fundamentally interested in the concept of representation. That's one of our big interests in political philosophy, a concept which we've heard mentioned by both Jenny and Richard already this evening. And some of you will have been here in the Philosopher Kings debates that we had last summer, which this is a kind of continuation of. Plato, the great ancient Greek philosopher, said that society should be run by philosophers, essentially. Philosopher kings, he called them, or guardians. Whereas, of course, we live in a time which is fundamentally democratic, and that's at the centre of the issues that have been raised here this evening about the current status of the House of Lords. Richard mentioned in particular, when he talked about representation, he talked about representing his constituents. That was what he highlighted, which of course makes good sense. But I just want to draw attention to the thought that aren't there other dimensions that we have to have in mind when we think about who politicians are representing? So Jenny, we've mentioned already, has no constituency as such. But does that mean that she's not representing anybody when she's in the House of Lords? I don't think that follows at all. I mean, clearly, among other things, she's representing the Green point of view. But I don't think it even stops there. I want to suggest here that we consider the ideas of the great conservative political philosopher Edmund Burke, who suggested that it wasn't good enough to think of parliamentary representatives as representing merely the people who are around now, for example, merely their constituents who turn up to their surgery. That we ought to think of society as a kind of compact between the people who are here now, people from the past, and people who are yet to come. And I'd like to suggest that the people who are yet to come are particularly important, and I'm sure this will be music to the ears of Jenny at least, but hopefully to everybody. The House of Lords has often been an institution that has been taken to have a longer view than the House of Commons, which gets elected repeatedly. Does the long view of the House of Lords, which, as we've heard, is populated at the present time mainly by elders, adequately look forward into the future? That's really the big question that I want to try to add into the debate and see what colleagues here think and see perhaps what you think as well. And before I hand back to Eloise and over to you to get further into this discussion, I'd just like to draw your attention to what's on the board right now, which is this fascinating blog that the politics department here at UEA has launched here today. My own contribution on this tries to address this question, and I propose if you want to go to that and have a look at it later, you'll find it, the whole thing, I think, quite impressive. My own contribution there seeks to modernise the concept of philosopher kings or guardians for the future, and to suggest that some kind of element of our political system, of our representative system, needs to represent the future. And I propose a mechanism by means of which this could be done. It does seem to me that one possible way in which it could be done, which I don't discuss in the piece, might be to do with how we think about a reformed House of Lords. So in terms of Richard's worry about, well, will the House of Lords clash, will a reformed House of Lords, a Senate, clash with the House of Commons? What if we were to give the House of Lords, the reformed House of Lords, a Senate, a particular interest or responsibility for seeking to take account of and perhaps to represent the needs, the wishes of the future, of future people, of our descendants yet to come?
Thank you very much, Rupert. I'm sure there must be some questions. I have a couple of volunteers.